What a sad day is today. We are now 594 years since the time the traitorous French Burgundians, after capturing Joan of Arc, delivered her to the Bishop of Beauvoir, who would then hand her over to perfidious Albion, the British, to stand trial and eventually be burned at the stake. Blessed be her name. Now, what we shouldn't burn at the stake are the results of a few days ago from the finished beta testing of this week when it comes to the raid, and this time from 4 different mythic bosses being tested. So once again, we can go over and check the results and compile how the specs have been performing even after the latest round of balance tuning and some changes to different specs to see how they are now performing. We are going to compile a tier list based on the results of this last round of tuning and also observe the performance of different specs based, for example, on the damage profile of the fight, if it was single target or cleave or AoE, etc, etc. We have to start by saying that we had to practically exclude some of these specs due to their very low participation in the testing, and these are the specs in question. So 2 of the mage specs not called Arcane, Devastation, Outlaw, Assassination and Destruction Warlock. These specs simply weren't really used nearly as much, and for most of these, when they were being used, the results were also quite poor. Part of it because the spec itself is doing quite badly right now, like the rogue specs, or part of it because perhaps most of the good mage players were testing Arcane rather than testing Fire or Frost. So these specs right here get some TBD, some perhaps waiting buffs type of text next to them. Can't really judge them properly right now. Now, as for the others, we are starting with the results of the Silken Court. The Silken Court is the 2-target fight, the second last boss, so we're talking about some tough encounter right here, which is unfortunately to be practically excluded from the results. That's because with the addition of the mythic mechanic, groups weren't really able to cope. The boss lasted even less than 2 minutes for most groups because of how hard it was, so it's very difficult to gauge anything, to be able to take anything from these results. Unless we want to believe that the average Survival Hunter is doing 80,000 DPS and the average Affliction Warlock is doing 7 times as much as a Survival, or a Fury Warrior is losing in DPS to a Holy Paladin. That's not really the case, it's just the boss was in a pretty rough shape for testing. The one that was more testable, although still quite challenging and lasting roughly 3 minutes per attempt, was the Nexus Princess. She was arguably the more relevant of the testing because this one is the pure single target fight. No interruption, no ads, no breaks, just do damage on single target. So you get to see quite clearly the power in single target of your specs. Now, the power through the logs and also through the rankings, as you can see here, is quite consistent, and we will also see through multiple bosses the same colors roughly, the Unholy Death Knight, but also Frost, DK, Arcane, Mage, as well as at times Affliction Warlock or Elemental Shaman have been amongst the better performers, but in single target you also have the addition of Beast Mastery Hunter, Pack Leader Beast Mastery Hunter. They are having a much better results in single target than in the other type of fights that were tested in the beta. One of the, I guess, major changes compared to just a few weeks ago is the full swap at the moment of Unholy Death Knights away from the multiple times nerfed Sun Lane hero talent tree. Now they are playing with their Riders of the Apocalypse. This gives them, to be fair, a little bit more of a simplistic damage profile, as it is very visible here. This is now the style of an Unholy Death Knight. They are much more centered around their cooldowns, because of course that's what your hero talent, the Riders of the Apocalypse, is gonna do. Once you use your CD, all 4 of them are going to be summoned at once, plus you also gain a bunch of damage buffs when they are all out, so that is now how you will look at when looking at a Unholy DK type of damage profile, and they will have one of the higher bursts, or I guess periods, of single target damage. You can see here they are able to break the 3 million DPS damage burst window. If you look at, for example, one of the other better performing specs, which is Arcane, It's continuing to be Arcane, there's no change here. Arcane is one of the other few specs that can reach this number or get close to this 3 million DPS burst. No other spec right now, practically, besides these two, is getting to that number. For example, even if we mention BM Hunter doing very well, even Elemental Shaman doing very well, their burst window is not nearly as high, or rather nearly as high for as long as both Arcane and Unholy. Same goes for specs like Elemental, who can't even see the 3 million in their graph because they don't even get close to that. And the last one of the specs doing quite well in this damage profile is Affliction. Affliction is also not a particularly heavy bursting spec, but they do have frequent 1 minute windows, as we have talked about this multiple times. They're lining up of Phantom Singularity with the 10% damage increase, their Malevolence, their Soul Rot, all tying together every minute. So not very high burst once every 2 or 3 minutes, but weaker but more often windows of burst for Affliction, and this is in single target. The next boss down the list that was tested, this is practically Diurna. It's gonna be a whole rotation of which eggs do we break in which order for the adds to spawn, and then we have to handle the adds a different way. Particularly hard the part about the interrupt and the entire quadrant of the room that will spawn more of these must interrupt mobs. Now this one lasted a bit more than the other fights, 3 to 4 minutes for many of the logs, and of course, as you can see by the results, we start having more window for possible burst AoE damage. You can see we praised Beast Mastery for being good in single target, but suddenly now we are talking about AoE, and now survival and marksmanship for Hunter are far higher than Beast Mastery is. Some of the other specs we have mentioned are still here, again, like Affliction, like Arcane, like Unholy, like Frost Decay. We have mentioned them before, and they're still doing very well, but the real clown result is the burst AoE you do whenever you have to break the eggs and spawn the adds. In this case, for example, you have your Marksmanship Hunter doing what you expect of a Hunter with Sentinel. If you remember, this is very reminiscent of the days of pre-Shadowlands release when Hunters were playing with Night Fae and having their Covenant ability burst window on a couple of minutes. Very powerful circle on the ground AoE ability every couple of minutes. The difference here that Sentinel by itself doesn't actually have a proper cooldown, and you can use it slightly more often. It's more active than an actual cooldown since it can proc from multiple sources on your kit. And remember, this is the severely nerfed version of Symphonic Arsenal and Sentinel, and this is still doing this well on a fight like Broad Twister. Obviously there are going to be windows for other specs to pull off this type of burst damage, like for example Unholy DK with Epidemic can do somewhat similar. In the case of the, I guess, newly reworked Elemental Shaman, you can have somewhat similar with just Earthquake spam on the enemies. Spec for AoE, spec for lightning damage, practically ignore using Lava Burst, which is what otherwise you will be doing, for a lot of AoE damage. That's why also Elemental is showing up with very good results. Now it starts to be a warning though when Elemental needs to go from a completely single target build to do well in single target, or AoE build to do well in AoE, but then you also have a spec like Arcane who doesn't even need to do particularly anything different. Their damage profile is still very similar. They are swapping 2 to 3 talents at best to go from single target to AoE while still being able to do very good AoE damage, right? If you look at, for example, the damage done to just the boss, the Elemental will be losing much more than the Arcane for going on their Earthquake build compared to the damage that an Arcane Mage can still do on single target, even while doing pretty good AoE damage. The other one that you start seeing doing progressively well the more you go from single target, like we were here, where Fury was just averagely mediocre, down to a more AoE burst window, it's Fury, right? Fury is similar to Marksmanship, growing up quite a lot when it comes to doing AoE damage, and that's what they are doing thanks to Bladestorm, tied with Odin's Fury, tied with Thunderous Roar, and if they're playing the hero talent, then tied also with Demolish, which can also be used and timed whenever the adds are spawning. This is, thanks to their short cooldowns. These adds on Ovinax spawn, you see, barely a minute apart. So specs with, super strong AoE, but only every couple of minutes are not going to have nearly as good of a result compared to other specs that have shorter 1 minute cooldown like Fury Warrior can in this kind of AoE fight. Now the last boss on the list is Rashanan. Now Rashanan is going to have a somewhat similar damage profile based on when he is spawning adds. You see the raid damage, and these are when the adds are spawning. That's telling me something, right? AoE damage, big. You get, I think, 18, the 2 tanks aren't spawning them, but like 18 adds spawning at once, and you have to just turbo AoE them down. So it is a similar situation to Blood Twister, where you have a bunch of adds spawning every once in a while. And you can see here as well, we have kind of one dominating result, which is Fury. Right, Fury is severely benefiting from this. Also because now the timing of the adds spawning is even better, right? It's lining up even better for Fury because it's every 1.5 minutes rather than every minute, which means you can also line up now every single time Thunderous Roar. On the previous fight, you could only line up your Odin's Fury and Blaze Storm every minute because Thunderous Roar had a 90-second cooldown. But because the adds on this fight spawn roughly every 90 seconds, now Fury can also line up Thunderous Roar together with his 2 other cooldowns. This results in Fury being the overall best DPS in this fight. But again, that is specifically just for AoE, just for this fight. If we go back to the pure single target fight, Fury is very mediocre. But in pure single target, Unholy, Arcane, Affliction, Frost, Elemental are still here. And then we move back to this, AoE fight, and Arcane is still here. Elemental is still here. Unholy is still here. Frost is still here. So there are some specs that are still doing very well in AoE, and then still doing very well in single target, and then still doing very well in an AoE with only 4 to 5 targets. Again, Unholy, Frost, Arcane, Elemental, they're still here. And then certain specs that are only doing well in certain types of damage profile, like in this question, Fury. If we take away Fury, we still see some similar names after the warrior spec. Frost as well is also now doing very well with a dual wield obliterate build after the several buffs they have received to their talent tree in particular. It is now performing much better. Arcane, as mentioned, continues to do very well regardless of the amount of targets you're fighting. At the moment, it's perhaps the overall best performer in the raid. So based on all of these results, also very useful that you can swap from, single target to AoE every minute on 4 to 5 targets, and then AoE every 90 seconds on like 20 targets. So very good spread of damage profile. The weakest performers, after the ones we have excluded due to the lack of enough logs, are Shadow Priest, Marksmanship, Feral, Balance, and Arms. Now, Marksmanship will look kind of off because they are doing very well in the turbo AoE fights, but they are still quite weak in single target, so they were only able to do very well whenever there was to do a ton of AoE, and outside of that, they have been much poorer. Also, they're still getting ultra carried by their hero talent. Remember, the initial statements by Blizzard were to be aiming at your hero talent doing or contributing for 20 to 25% of your damage. So having, for example, an Arcane Mage playing with Spellslinger and having Arcane Splinter plus Splinter Storm being 23% of your damage is within the limit. Having a Marksmanship Hunter do 50% of his damage with a hero talent is not. That's why they end up here, even though in a couple of results for pure AoE they are actually doing well. The other specs though are not in Marksmanship's category, they are just doing mediocre damage overall in the different types of damage. Arms, Balance, they're still, hanging quite low. Feral as well when it comes to AoE is doing worse as well. The results in general are not that great for these specs, especially they don't have even a single one where they can break at the very least the top 10 of the results. This is not the same for the specs in the middle: Windwalker, Enhancement, Demo, Survival, Subtlety, Ret, and Fury. These do have moments, they have windows where they are seen doing well. Nexus Princess, for example, is a pure single target fight, and in this pure single target, Survival is in the top 10. Blood Twister has some adds spawning, and Survival is right at the edge of the top 10. Rashanan has a lot more adds spawning, and Survival is not doing nearly as well. But for the other two fights, the results are quite good. Enhancement is also doing well on Rashanan. On Blood Twister, it's, you know, top half of the results, and average on Nexus Princess. So again, it's an average to okay set of results. Subtlety is the only surviving decent performer when it comes to rogues compared to the other two specs. Ret also, although not nearly as well as before as it used to do, is still in an okay position. You have Demo. Despite praising Affliction for the results, Demo does have some better results when it comes to AoE damage. That was being played more than Affliction on Rashanan because of their CD lining up for AoE damage and implosion damage on Rashanan. So that's where you would rate spec in this average tier. They're not bad, they're doing good in some fights. In some fights they even get into the top half, close to the top 10 of the results. Moving on to the next tier, these are the ones that are either good overall, so right at the edge of the top 10 or slightly inside of the top 10 of results, or perhaps a little bit lower down, but they have multiple results in the top 10, or even close, in the top 5. The closest one to getting into the S tier is, for example, Frost. Frost is 4th in pure single target. In Blood Twister with a few adds spawning every minute, it's, what, 7th? And then in large AoE every 90 seconds, it's 6th. So very high results on average. Elemental is similar. Elemental is 4th in very large AoE. It's still 4th in shorter AoE fights, and in pure single targets it's 5th. So again, very high average results. Beast Mastery, that is also here, and Augmentation, that are also here, are slightly different. They are very high in single target. In AoE, they drop a bit further down, and in very large AoE, they're also, you know, slightly top half of the results, but nothing, you know, major. We haven't mentioned Havoc. That's because Havoc practically has not changed place. Havoc has just been chilling in roughly the same position for practically all the boss fights, all the damage profiles. They are, you know, top half, right outside of the top 10 consistently. So that's where they land. So that is where they land in the overall results. And then you have the top 3. At last, the top 3 being Unholy, Arcane, and Affliction. This is, well, based on the results, Unholy was 2nd, and then Unholy was 3rd, and then Unholy was 1st. Arcane was 2nd, Arcane was 5th, and then Arcane was 5th. And then you have Affliction, which was 3rd, and then it was 6th, and then it was lower down in AoE after more Warlocks played out the demo build for Rashanan. But you also have to consider that you kind of have to weigh a little bit more importantly the single target of a spec, more so than some turbo AoE on 20 targets every 90 seconds. That's like Mythic Plus level of power, not nearly as relevant in a raid encounter. So Affliction losing out on that type of damage profile for the raid is not that relevant. It's much more important for them to be this good in single target at the moment. Same goes for BM, and why they still end up quite high in the temporary tier list based on their results in this last set of tuning. So that is what we have observed so far in this latest round of tuning, once again with quite some diversity in the damage profiles of the bosses. Of course, we can see from the results some requests for buffs, some requests for nerfs. We will see how will Blizzard adapt after seeing yet another round of results in the raid. But for now, this was the recap on how things went in the latest round of testing. So, for today on this Sunday, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your weekend. We're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, as well as everyone who is also supporting by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, don't you hate it? Don't you hate it when you are ready to chill at home all day and then you realize you have forgot something and you have to go out and buy it?